So let's see if just to verify. Yep, looks good. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Uh, this is part two of my William Tecumseh Sherman Scourge of a Safe Part Two, which will be which where we left off from last week. It was a matter of Sherman has been promoted to commanding of all Western Theatre armies. So Ulysses Grant, at this point, he commands all Union forces as the commanding general, taking over from Henry Halleck, who at this point has been reassigned to become chief of staff. Because the thing about Henry Halleck, of course, he was kind of like the Berthier of the Union Army in that sense. Like he wasn't a good field guy, and previous campaigns shown it. As I mentioned, for example, talking about Ambrose Burnside, the Battle of Fredericksburg, and so on. So yeah, Ulysses Grant becomes commanding general of all Union armies in March of 1864, and to take control of the Western Theater, covering Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, as well as later campaigns places like Georgia and the Carolinas, will of course be William T. Sherman. And the first campaign, and this stream will cover through, for example, the Atlanta campaign, where he fights off against Joseph E. Johnston, and then for Atlanta itself, he fights John Bell Hood. Before then, John Bell Hood stupidly attacks Nashville, and what need more be said about that than what was mentioned back on Nathan Bedford Forrest Part 2 in regards to how stupidly John Bell Hood attacks in the Nashville campaign. So that's where Hood departs from the tale in regard to Sherman, while in the case of dealing with the March to the Sea, it's mainly Joseph Wheeler, and I will just say blatantly, I do not have a high. Joseph Wheeler was probably he felt like easy mode comparing to fighting against Joseph E. Johnston. Like Johnston, I mean, there's a reason why Johnston. I will go over this why. For example, Joseph E. Johnston, as Sherman says in his memoirs, as well as in other books I've read on this topic, which due to a headache I've got at the moment, so I might usually I will put my sources right after the stream. I might delay it until I wake up tomorrow morning just because I've still got a slight headache, so that might be why I might be a bit late in putting my sources. But I did do a fair bit of reading because last week I didn't bother putting in sources because I only really was using William T. Sherman's memoirs because leading up to this point, there's not a great deal of controversy in anything Sherman does. I suppose there is in terms of his views on slavery for the time, but even then, I don't really see that as controversial in the grand scheme of things because it was not atypical of his time, and Sherman was very much of so of this time you have what were called the War Democrats, so guys like George B. McClellan, who they believed in the Civil War in terms of fighting against secession, but they weren't abolitionists like Abraham Lincoln was. Well, Abraham Lincoln even meant like he was only against expanding slavery at the time. Perhaps he was always an abolitionist, but it's only really the Emancipation Proclamation and then eventually the 13th Amendment where that becomes pronounced. Whereas in the early days of the Civil War, the vast majority of Union soldiers were fighting to restore the Union. They were not fighting to free the slaves, as is common belief amongst many people, especially in America, of course, on the sort of more left wing side of things, and sort of what you might say centre right kind of like GOP types. They might think the war was fought only for slavery. Well, not in the opening stages, at least. That wasn't the case. Sherman, for example, at the start of the war, he was of the same opinion as guys like George B. McClellan and others, where it was all about, well, we are fighting to restore the Union. We are not fighting to destroy the Southern way of life. We are not fighting to get rid of slavery, per se, but rather to restore the Union. It's only later on the views change as the war goes on. So two sides get embittered, and the toll escalates even more and more about both sides. So I suppose you could say radicalized because you have guys like, for example, because it's worth noting William T. Sherman is associated with a view of sort of an early onset of total war. He wasn't beyond now. There were guys who were sending him a horn about this much earlier than he was, and one of those guys was Thaddeus Stevens, who, if anyone's watched that film from 2012, Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis, where Thaddeus Stevens is played by Tommy Lee Jones. Thaddeus Stevens, yeah, he's very much a firebrand, radical egalitarian type of a radical Republican faction who, even in the starting phases of the war, he was insisting that women and children be treated in the same way as combatants, because in his view, the home front, like the Southern women especially, were seen as aiding and abetting the Southern war effort, and therefore they had to be treated on the same terms as the men fighting. At the start of the war, most people were horrified, fully, at such a theory of war being applied ever like that. It's only by the time we get to a march to the sea under Sherman in late 1864 that really that idea is put into practice, because by that time both sides have become fairly embittered towards one another. Although reconciliation does happen after the war for obvious reasons. But yeah, this is one thing to factor in mind, is that Sherman, his view changes from the start of the war to the end of the war, which is why, as I'll detail later on in the March to the Sea, this is why there are some controversial episodes that happen, which you got to factor that into your analysis of whether you think Sherman was a villain for what he did on the March to the Sea, because it's also worth noting that he did have mental health problems. Like, he would have what we would call manic depression, similar to Oliver Cromwell. Plus, also, as at the start of the war, he was very much partial to the South. Like, he spent some time in Louisiana teaching military sciences to students in Louisiana, and he was very much of a pro, like similar to Lincoln, because people think, like Lincoln, for example, his favorite song was Dixie. So it's fair to say that Sherman was not at all like. That's the main reason why I haven't played a song for Sherman, is because he did not like all the triumphalism that happened, especially after the war, especially that Marching for Georgia song. People might know of. Sherman hated that song, so that's what I haven't done a piece of music, because it would be kind of dishonoring him to do that when in his own lifetime he hated that song. So yeah, that's why you won't see me playing that song whenever doing a stream about William T. Sherman. So yeah, I believe that's the introduction started. So I'll just share screen now. I don't. Yeah. So March 1862. I mean, not 1862, 1864. Sorry. This is the state of play. You've got on the sort of geographical boundaries. You've got, so after the Vicksburg campaign, the Mississippi River, in all its entirety, it has been fully taken by the Union. So the Confederacy is split in half. You got most of Arkansas, for example, taken over by the Union. You got Texas, which is still Confederate territory, and this is like what you call the Trans-Mississippi kind of campaign, which that can deserve a certain stream of its own, but there's not a great deal to be said about it. Although it's worth noting, there were Native American tribes who were fighting on the Confederate side, which that doesn't get mentioned a lot in Civil War parlance after the fact. Yeah, so very interesting kind of theatre of a war. Whereas here, yeah, you get, and this is where, for example, as you can see it, Grant's planned for the 1864 campaign. So you have Meade in charge of the Army of the Potomac, who's to bear down on Lee, alongside Benjamin Butler here in Norfolk, Virginia, along the coast, to bear down on Richmond. Sherman, meanwhile, is to get down to take Atlanta, because I can see if I can find. Yeah, so one thing you'll find is that with all the railways that can converge all the way to like Richmond through places like Danville and Wilmington, Atlanta is very much important as a railway junction between the Western and Eastern theatres. So Jefferson Davis, he absolutely has Atlanta earmarked down as being an incredibly important cog, I suppose you could say, in the in the war effort. Certainly, it's a very important transport depot, and the idea of losing Atlanta to a determined assault from someone like Sherman is something that would give him sleepless nights on the strategic side of a war. So, yeah, this is where you get Sherman. At this time, Eastern Tennessee has been fully. It's worth noting, Eastern Tennessee, for example, around Knoxville, that has always been pro-Union, and there were rebellions against the Confederacy in the early stages of the war, whereas most of Tennessee, of course, West, pro-Confederate. And yeah, you get. So yeah, after the Vicksburg campaign had been fully done with, you then have, like, then, for example, they secure the rest of Mississippi, they get into Alabama. Sherman, meanwhile, yeah, he's got his plan to take Atlanta, and this becomes what we know today as Atlanta campaign, which very interesting campaign, and we'll go into detail about the two sides. So yeah, and this is sort of a broader strategic map of what happens in 1864 to 65. So you have, for example, Sherman bears down on Atlanta, and then he goes on to Savannah in the famous March to the Sea, and then he goes to the Carolinas, while Grant and Lee battle it out in the Overland campaign, and eventually you have a siege of Petersburg and the surrender of Appomattox in April 1865. Now, of course, this is William T. Sherman. This guy is Joseph E. Johnston, Sherman's main antagonist in the whole campaign. Like, he's the guy who's dispatched to deal with Sherman in the context of the Atlanta campaign. Now, it's worth noting that Joseph E. Johnston, I would say, when people talk, for example, of a Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular War being a very defensive guy, that can easily be said of Joseph E. Johnston. Like, Joseph E. Johnston was not a particularly aggressive guy. He would attack if odds are in his favor. So make no mistake, he is willing to be aggressive when the time calls for it. Such as, for example, at the Battle of Seven Pines, where he gets wounded in April 1862, and his replacement is Robert E. Lee. And as mentioned in the Stonewall Jackson streams, that's where you get famously Robert E. Lee with the 7 days battles and the Peninsula campaign and so on. So no need to hash that one out. But yeah, Joseph E. Johnston, he gets wounded right before Robert E. Lee takes over in Virginia. And for a long time, he's dealing with the injuries. And then, of course, he's in the Vicksburg campaign, where he does his best, but because of political intrigues to do with Jefferson Davis, because Johnston and Davis do not get on. Johnston, for example, never owned a slave, and he does not think of slavery as a good thing, which gets him a bad side of Davis, who was very much pro-slavery. So yeah, so that's one thing to bear in mind for this is one thing that really dominates as a factor in why the Atlanta campaign happens the way it does for the Confederates, in terms of, for example, Joseph E. Johnston later being replaced with John Bell Hood, was that, put simply, you just have Johnston having to deal with political drama with Jefferson Davis, alongside, of course, his military advisor, Braxton Bragg, because it's worth noting, after the Chattanooga campaign, Braxton Bragg, he relinquishes command of the Army of Tennessee, and he basically fails right up to being Jefferson Davis's own military advisor. Very much a simple fact of, well, Jefferson Davis plays favorites, and Johnston not being one of them, he really loses out in what I will later detail. So yeah, this is sort of a state of play. You have, for example, as mentioned before, the Meridian campaign, and then you have George H. Thomas here with 60,000 men, and yeah, you have, this is like early onset of the year 1864 for the Western Theatre. Now, the Atlanta campaign, yeah, so as mentioned, the Chattanooga campaign leaves area around Chattanooga here under control of the Union forces. You have Johnston, who in early May, he fortifies around an area called Dalton. Now, he does hold here fairly well for a time. However, at this place, let's see if I can find I can't. Yeah. Anyway, this creek here on Johnston's left flank, he does get outflanked by McPherson, which the thing was, yeah, Johnston. This is one thing that Johnston has to constantly deal with for the rest of the campaign. Is just he hasn't got enough cavalry, and one of the main problems he's got is so his cavalry guy is a guy by the name of Joseph Wheeler or Fighting Joe Wheeler. Now, Wheeler was similar to Jeb Hooker. I mean, not Jeb Hooker, Jeb Stewart. Sorry, Jeb Stewart. In terms of he being a very brave guy, but not the sharpest tool in the shed. And one way that displays is that on paper, Wheeler will say he's got 10,000 cavalry, but only 2,000 of them are actually effective for the campaign. So yeah, you have this situation where Johnston will regularly complain over to Jefferson Davis and Bragg that he hasn't got enough cavalry, but Bragg and Davis also, on paper, you got 10,000 as per what your cavalry guy Joseph Wheeler says, and yeah, this is just one of those things where it's something so very simple that shouldn't, on Wheeler's part, that should not have been put into place to begin with, which is that when you're putting down on paper how much your strength is, you should be putting down how many are actually up there for battle. Another factor, and this relates to also the horses, is that the draft horses and mules that Johnston's got in his army, they're not up to the task. So they constantly have to deal with logistical burdens that had they had the horses and mules they had in, let's say, the early stages of the war, they would not be having. So this is another issue that Johnston has to deal with, is that a lot of his marching has to be a lot more lightweight than it otherwise would be. And this is why there are times where perhaps he could have, in another time, he could have held on a lot longer to certain positions along the campaign. But because of the fact that he has to bear in mind the horses and mules are not the best, he has to retreat. There's a lot less margin for sort of guessing the time he has to pull back for when he does eventually get outflanked. Because this is one thing that Sherman does, and many times throughout the campaign, is he outflanks Johnston. Because while Johnston has 60,000 men, Sherman has 100,000. And he often dispatches McPherson, for example, to outflank, such as what he does here, as you can see on this map, where through this creek here on Johnston's left flank here, you have this place you've dug a gap where, so Johnston, he's got 60,000 men, and he's having to fortify his position. I mean, that's one thing Johnston cannot be faulted on, is he really is good at picking his ground, very good at picking a good defensive position to hold up in and forestall any sort of Union advance on the part of Sherman. And Sherman, he's smart enough to know that he has to outflank. He can't do a frontal assault. There are times where he does do a frontal assault, and it's kind of against his wisdom, and which especially the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which I will go into detail later. Yeah, so yeah, you just have this situation where Johnston, for example, his battle place called dug a gap on his extreme left flank. He's only got like 250 guys from Arkansas, alongside an under-strength cavalry. I think it's barely like a cavalry battalion, strength force. Not a good scenario to be in if you're Johnston, where you're constantly being outflanked because the enemy has far more numbers to bring to bear, and it doesn't matter how good his defensive ground is. There's always factors outside of his control, or factors he just has to deal with that force him to pull back, and this becomes a massive area of disagreement and an argument with Jefferson Davis. But this is where I would say, I mean, I'm actively biased, by the way, in terms of being on Johnston's side, because I think Johnston, 9 times out of 10, he did the right moves throughout the campaign. It's just he fell afoul of politicians. Now, Grant, for example, by this stage in the war, the Union, they've got past Lincoln meddling all the damn time, because as mentioned before in the past, Lincoln had a massive problem of interfering with Union Army generals and logistics and so on, especially against like someone like George B. McClellan and Meade and so on. Whereas, but by the time you get to Grant in March 1864, Lincoln knows at this point he has to back off, and Grant is able to strong arm Lincoln into saying, well, look, if he's going to take the big job of commanding all Union forces, he has to have complete freedom of action and not have to, constantly deal with politics. And Lincoln at this time is actually willing to grant it because he knows full well he can't keep interfering. Whereas Jefferson Davis, he doesn't do this, constantly micromanaging and constantly shifting their commanders to the detriment of the Western theatre, especially. So, for example, with Braxton Bragg, he refused to get rid of him, despite the fact that it was fairly well obvious, even by the Battle of Chickamauga, let alone after that, that Braxton Bragg had to go, but Jefferson Davis was too cowardly to get rid of him. So yeah. You're not too. You're not too late. I haven't gone to a massive deep. I've done a fairly lengthy introduction, and so yeah, not at all. Not at all. Not at all tardiness on your part. So yeah, welcome. So Joseph E. Johnston, as I've mentioned, he's got 100,000 men under Sherman bearing down upon him. He can have these really good defensive positions, but at the end of the day, he still keeps getting outflanked, and he has to pull back. And also, as mentioned, the horses and mules he's got are not in the best condition, so he's got he has a lot less margin for error when picking his times to pull back. So he pulls back to a place called Resaca around here. Now, the thing about Resaca was that McPherson, for reasons so the thing was, Joseph E. Johnston puts 2 brigades here because he knows full well that Resaca is he has to fall back to Resaca in the event of having to pull back. And McPherson has an entire army corps, but for reasons unknown, he just doesn't take the place. So, for example, May 13th. So you have factored that, for example, the area around Dalton, these battles happen between around May 6th and 7th. So Johnston has to pull back down these roads through Tilton to get to Resaca, where 2 brigades under a guy called Canty, they hold off McPherson's entire army corps long enough that Johnston is able to get there, and McPherson is too cautious to push his advantage, which is a massive missed opportunity on his part, because had McPherson pushed on the town, he would have taken it, and then Johnston would have had his retreat cut. But and this is one thing where Sherman says himself in his own personal memoirs, he wasn't going to get into the habit of massive chastising his subordinates, because every debate it's all well and good, Sherman being, for example, over here in Ringgold, as well as around the Dalton area, without knowing the circumstances to what led McPherson to be so cautious and timid, fighting against a couple of brigades. Because so this is one thing that Sherman can be commended for. He's not like Braxton Bragg, who will chastise his subordinates right out in the open and do so in such ways that end up just rubbing everyone the wrong way. So that's what happened with Dalton and Resaca. So you have, as I've mentioned here, you have then Johnston. He goes to a place called Calhoun, which of course is named after what was his name? Calhoun, basically the South Carolina senator who famously opposed Andrew Jackson in the nullification crisis. Very much a hero for the South of this time, for example. So you have, and one thing you'll notice, for example, as I mentioned earlier, was the railway is always, it's very predictable, where in a way, Johnston will say he can't read Sherman very well. It's worth noting more about that. Sherman, he's constantly going down the railways because it's all about logistics, for arguments similar to, for example, the Russian war in Ukraine, where fighting is done often amongst either high ground or railways and other logistical centres. So, for example, you have Johnston, for example, who arrives here on May 16th. He can't hold here, so he has to pull back over to Adairsville. He was thinking about holding here, but then the Federals advanced too quickly for him to hold up. And it's at this point he has to make a choice, which it wasn't really hard for him to make, but it was a painful one nonetheless, because you see here it says to Rome, which Rome in Georgia had important ironworks that were important for the production of cannons. Sorry, for the Confederate war effort. Now, the loss of that does much to really drive even bigger a wedge between Johnston and Davis back in Richmond. So yeah, I was thinking. I'm not because I usually know a lot of these Confederate. I usually know a lot of these American historical figures by their initials rather than their names, because that's just how a lot of historical figures of that time are recorded in these books I'm reading. So I think it's like J.C. Calhoun or something like that. I could be wrong, in which case I'll be correct. I can be corrected. But yeah, I know his name started with a J, so yeah, that seems right. So yeah, you have Johnston. He has to pull back. Now you have here Cassville. Now Cassville was one thing worth noting. I don't know if it's a very apparent here, but you see, it's kind of delineated features which made it such a good position for Johnston. Like Johnston knew this ground and he wanted to hold up here, because one thing he noted was that, so you have one of the main roads here through Daresville, goes down here. You have Hood on the right flank, and then you have Hardy, who goes down this road, of course, taking two different roads to ease the traffic on the roads. So you have Hardy on the left flank and Hood on the right. Now, you see here ambush positions, May 19th, because what Johnston was banking on was that the Federals would advance, because he knew that Sherman would also take the same decisions he would in terms of taking several roads to ease traffic on, because the roads are not the best in this part of like Georgia, for example. So Johnston is banking upon that Sherman will divide his army in order to achieve maximal sort of coordination and so on. And the thing about the terrain is that, like, you got, for example, like a sort of a ridge around here, you got forest, you got sort of like a broken ground, so that Johnston was hoping that he could defeat Sherman's columns in detail. In so doing, he could actually savage Sherman's army in such a way that even if he doesn't win a complete decisive victory in a way that someone like Davis hopes for, at the very least, he will help to even the odds. And on paper, this seemed like a very great plan. However, human error comes in to screw up the plan, because you see here Federal column. Because the thing was, Hood, he got spooked, where a Federal column, and the thing was, this Federal column was a brigade on a guy called Daniel Butterfield. Now, Hood got really spooked, which the thing about Johnston was he relied upon Hood for advice in the same way that General Lee relied a lot on Stonewall Jackson, because Hood was very aggressive by instinct, which goes against the sort of, because as previously mentioned, Johnston has this reputation for being very defensive. I wouldn't say he's purely defensive, because he's similar to the Duke of Wellington. I would argue for, and I imagine if Iron Duke, for example, watches this now or later on, I imagine he will find it very relatable to what Wellington did against Messina in Portugal, where Johnston, his entire plan for this entire thing is stretch out the Federal army along the way, defending really good ground of his choosing, and bleed the Federals while at the same time overstretching the logistics so he can send his cavalry around. The main errors, of course, is that you got human error. So Joseph Wheeler, for example, he doesn't have enough cavalry, and there's not really a luxury of sort of operational flexibility, because the cavalry can't exactly be sent like Nathan Bird to Forest. So Joseph Wheeler has to stick close to the army and hold. So yeah, you just have these times where Joseph Wheeler has to wheel around to left flank or right flank, because Hood might have to be redeployed and so on. Like, it's very much a matter of all hands on deck, so to speak, and with reserves. So yeah, you have this Federal column of not even like a brigade, a brigade, I should say, full strength brigade, that spooks Hood and he falls back to here. Now, the thing was, so by the time at Johnston, because Johnston, he was completely in disbelief at just the fact that Hood had run away, because one thing I've mentioned before on that Nathan Bird Forest stream part 2 was that Hood was very much known as an aggressive guy, and he's very much like a Marshal Ney of the Confederate Army. And I would agree with that assessment as well, because if one's watched the Epic History Marshals series, you'll know that Napoleon was quoted as saying that he thought of Ney as extremely good if you put him in charge of like 10,000 troops. But if you put him in charge of anything more than that, he's a true idiot. I would say the same of John Bell Hood. Like, Hood was very much of a, he's too aggressive. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed by any means. But I would also say, similar to Marshal Ney after Russia, John Bell Hood, by this point in the war, he's probably got PTSD, because, as mentioned before, he's lost his left arm. Like, in terms of the use of it, it's still right, but it's not functional. I mean, he lost his left arm, the use of it, I should say, at Gettysburg, while he lost his right leg, like 2 inches below the hip. He was amputated at the Battle of Chickamauga, and it's also worth noting that he commanded a brigade at the Battle of Antietam, where 80% of his troops were casualties. These troops being from Texas. So yeah. I don't think John Bell Hood was the same guy at this point of the war that he was at the beginning of it. Like, he went through three of the bloodiest Civil War battles, and and I don't know if I would say he's had a death wish, because in this campaign, as I'll go into detail, Hood, he gives good advice, but also he does fairly a lot of controversial decisions, which Johnston, as for example, there are two main controversies around here. So, for example, Hood pulls back, and Johnston's a matter of disbelief, and Johnston kind of has to accept it. His battle plan is up in tatters, so he has to pull back to his defensive positions nearby Cass Station, near the town of Cassville. Now, Hood, at this point, the rest of the Federal Army arrives, and he now has to deal with enfilading Federal fire against his position. Now, Polk, who's to his left in the center, Hood goes to Johnston and saying, "Look, we have to pull back." Although it's worth noting that there are different accounts. So Johnston, in his own narratives, he wrote 10 years after the war, he said that Hood told him to pull back, and no other option was given by Hood in his advice. Whereas Hood, as well as the son of Leonidas Polk, because it's worth noting that not long after this, in the midst of the Atlanta campaign, Leonidas Polk gets killed. So his son, William Polk, who was in his father's staff, he corroborates Hood when he says, like, Hood said to Johnston, "Look, we've got two options. We can either attack the Federal Army head on, or we can pull back across the Etowah River." Now, that seems more. Now, I'm more willing to agree with the latter sort of explanation of events, because the idea of John Bell Hood only saying we can only retreat. I mean, it's like the Battle of Franklin, as I mentioned a couple of weeks back, where he attacks stupidly. So I don't put it past someone like John Bell Hood to say we ought to attack the Federals, because this is one thing worth bearing in mind, is that Johnston is constantly on the retreat, and the men on the ground, while they do respect him as a general, they don't particularly like his tactic of constant retreat. They think that he's too much of a Nancy, too much of a coward on this one. And it's one of those things where there were quite a few desertions for this time. So it was a matter of Johnston was fighting an uphill battle with many loads of factors. And this is why on one hand, Joseph E. Johnston, is worth noting that when you read into his chain of, in terms of his perception of the chain of events, his perspective is coloured by the fact that when, for example, he's got to deliver dispatches, for example, to Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg, and he's got to embellish himself because he knows full well that his job is always on the line. Now, he might not care much for politics, but politics will care for him. And he understands that dichotomy, which is why you'll see in battles where William T. Sherman talks about this in his own memoirs, where he'll say, well, Johnston says he inflicted twice the amount of casualties upon Sherman's forces than he actually did. Now, I'm more willing to believe that Joseph Johnston, on one hand, he wanted to believe it because it suits his battle plan, but also that he kind of suited him politically as well, because he knew full well that he only was in that job commanding the Army of Tennessee on the good graces of Jefferson Davis, and he had to embellish himself in his dispatches in order to not get the sack. And this is one reason. This is one thing that you can't really trust Johnson in everything he says after the war, in terms of his in terms of what he says in his post-war historiography. So that's why. So that's why I didn't particularly read Joseph Johnson's narratives after the war per se, but I rather focused on books that offered an objective. So yeah, so the thing about Cassville, yeah, this is the main controversy where Hood was accused. What Johnson says in his book, Hood told him to fall back, whereas Hood himself says in his own what's called the lost papers of Confederate General John Bell Hood, that Hood advised either attack or pull back. And Johnston knows for what he can't attack, because just as Sherman will outflank him, Sherman will also make sure that he'll also entrench. So he makes sure not to. He makes sure that in the event of a Confederate attack, he's entrenched, because he learns his mistake from Shiloh, as did Grant. Now, piffle. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, so sorry, but so you have Cassville, where you get into May 21st. He crosses. He's cut by this point. He's crossed the Etowah River, and this is a big red flag for Jefferson Davis. It really just ruffles a lot of feathers in Richmond against Johnston. Now, at this point, Jefferson Davis is willing to stomach it, because he's thinking, well, he can't think of a replacement just yet. So, for the time being, Johnston keeps his job despite a growing level of dissatisfaction on the part of Jefferson Davis, as well as his military advisor, Braxton Bragg. So, yeah, you have him going past Allatoona. Now, he was thinking about holding up here, but Sherman outfoxed him around here. He goes past, for example, Union Hill Church, and you also got this Pumpkinson Creek, as you can see here. So this is where Johnston, he has battles. You can see a lot of battles here. For example, you got New Hope Church on May 25th. A couple of days later, for example, you got Pickett's Mill on May 27th, as well as the Battle of Dallas. Now, Battle of Dallas is actually quite. It's at this point in late May. This is a one time in the entire Atlanta campaign that Sherman actually pulls back, because up to this point he was always on the advance, but Sherman had to pull back after getting defeated at Dallas. Now, it wasn't a catastrophic defeat by any means, but it was certainly a defeat from which Sherman felt he had to pull back and recuperate his losses. Because another thing that you'll see throughout this is that Johnston inflicts more casualties upon Sherman than the other way around. But the thing is that Sherman can afford those casualties, because he's got the North supporting him, whereas Johnston, even though he's been reinforced by Polk's corps, who came in from Alabama, as well as gets a reinforcement of like a 2,500 strong brigade from Mobile on the Alabama coast. It's just a matter of Johnson can't afford losses in the same way that Sherman can. So yeah, this is where you just get these series of battles where you see Sherman. Also, one thing he does is he will have his forces march along. For example, a place like Dallas, as you can see, is a crossroads kind of town. And then you got New Hope Church, for example, is along the way towards getting to like Marietta, which is on the way towards Atlanta. Now, as you can see, so you get Johnston, he pulls back to Pine Mountain around here, like in mid-June. But before I get to that, so sorry, I'm misreading some of the dates. Beg apologies. So so Yeah, you see here, you see along here, Johnston reinforces, entrenches here. So you have, for example, you got Big Shanty here, you got Bush Mountain here on the right flank, and it goes all the way past Pine and Lost Mountains here, and it's almost like you got Powder Springs Church, for example, here, and this is where like he has his left flank now. The thing about Pine Mountain was this is where Leonard's Polk on the 14th of June gets killed by artillery shot. Like, it literally gets, he's scouting almost like nearby the crest of a hill. So he's on the downward slope of a hill. He's got his binoculars, and the binoculars, they reflect off the sun on that day. So Sherman knows full well that those scouts were important Confederate generals. You can see a mile off by their uniforms that these were incredibly important generals. So he orders his battery to open fire on them. Leonard's Polk, he actually gets killed by a cannonball that hits against his right shoulder and catapults him from his saddle and pins him to the hill. Almost like his body almost looks like it just got put in sort of the coffin itself, like how it was arranged from a cannonball, like a solid shot hitting him. He was killed almost instantly, and yeah, Union contemporaries of that time, they were saying to Sherman, "Well, you actually did a mistake killing off Polk because Polk was actually incompetent." And I go, I'm minded to agree with that, because the thing about Polk was he was more of a theoretical guy rather than an actual practical guy. And another thing about Polk is, for people who are inclined to American history, you might recognize that surname as being of the same family as James K. Polk, because that's the thing about Leonard's Polk was in 1846 or 47, he gets a commission in the American Army fighting the Mexican War because his cousin happened to be president, or none other than James K. Polk himself, who was president, of course, during the Mexican War. So that's how Leonard's Polk gets his original commission back in the Mexican War. And yeah, and then in the sort of interwar period between the Mexican and Civil Wars, he's an Episcopalian bishop, and then war's declared, and he gets a commission once more in the Confederate Army, and I wouldn't say no to doing a stream about him. Possibly at some point, I did go into more detail about him, but yeah, let's just say he was not the sharpest tool in the shed on a practical level. Theoretically, yes, he could come up with some good plans, but yeah, I wouldn't say he was great on the field as a commander. And certainly, yeah, he was stupid to scout in such a way that he actually ended up risking his life. Now, granted, scouting like the way he did, I mean, you don't expect it to get you killed, because how many Confederate generals, how many generals in the Civil War altogether were killed while scouting, or killed a fair distance away from the enemy lines? Because it's like you get certain generals like Reynolds and who else? I think Sedgwick and Jackson, who were killed very close to the front lines, whereas Polk wasn't. So yeah, that was an unexpected angle of things. So yeah, that's the state of play. Now to get onto the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Now, as you can see, you've got, it's a very much of a wooded. So Kennesaw Mountain is worth noting. The Kennesaw Mountain, like, you've got Big Kennesaw, which is around 800 feet high. Little Kennesaw Mountain was around 600 feet high. So these are very domineering positions, and it's very good defensive ground if you're the Confederates. And it's a matter where you see, like, it says, for example, demonstrations, because the thing about McPherson and Blair and Garrard was that they were meant to pin the Confederate right in place, while the center and Union right try and get around. They're hoping, for example, that, because this is textbook Napoleonic warfare, was that it's that you get, for example, one of the flanks being attacked, and you'll weaken your center to reinforce the attacked flank. Now, Joseph Johnston, he doesn't want, to quote the Duke of Wellington in the film Waterloo, Johnston isn't the kind of guy to run around like a wet hen. So he doesn't fall for this. And he's in a very good defensive position anyway. So his troops hold up fairly well. And this happens, for example, I believe the battle itself only takes place over So it starts at around 9:30 to 10 o'clock, and it ends pretty much by early till mid-afternoon. It was an attack that went on all day because after a certain point, Sherman knew well to cut his losses once he saw that attacking this defensive position at Kennesaw Mountain was just demanding too much on the part of his troops on the ground. So yeah, and to get a good this offers a better map. So you have, for example, Patrick R. Claiborne, for example. Originally, he was in the reserve for previous battles, but because of the nature of Union numbers, every man is needed pretty much at the front lines, and it's not like there's great opportunities for Johnston to be outflanked at this because, as I said, it's a wooded hill. It's just really awkward ground to begin with for the Union to try anything. So you've got Big Kennesaw Mountain here on the right flank, 800 feet high. You've got Pigeon Hill, you've got Little Kennesaw, so 600 feet high. And then you've got Claiborne and Cheatham warding off Thomas in the Army of the Cumberland. Meanwhile, you've got Schofield and Hooker dealing with Hood. Now, you see here Battle of Culp's Farm, where so Hood, again, this is one thing where I can feel confident to say that Hood was a true idiot in terms of war, was that so this ground here is open field. So Hood goes on the attack against this Union force, despite it being really open field. It's similar. It's like a miniature version of Pickett's Charge in a sense where under Hood, around 1,000 Confederates get killed and wounded, while it was only something like 350 Union casualties. Like very lots of casualties that the Confederates just can't afford, and this is one reason why the final casualty count in the Atlanta campaign was 35,000 for the Confederates and 32,000 for the Union. Now, if it was up to only Johnston, the Union would have suffered more casualties relative to the Confederates, but it's because of John Bell Hood mainly that the casualties go up so high for the Confederates. So, yeah. So there's a great element of there are a great many moments where I can look at his campaign and facepalm, mainly around the political dilemmas that Johnston was catapulted into. That he was doing the best he could, and he got Hood, who just chooses stupid ground to attack on, constantly being aggressive in such a way that the Confederates could not afford at this particular part of the Civil War. Yeah. One thing you notice as well, like so, you get the roads around Kennesaw Mountain. So, for example, you have Marietta, so you have Atlanta here, and you've got the Chattahoochee River. With Kennesaw Mountain, it was kind of one of those. It's a very high position, so it has a very domineering view of around here, the highest position in the land. So, if Sherman tried to outflank by going for these roads, for example, Johnston would know straight away, and there was no element of surprise on Sherman's part, whatever he did. So he had no choice but to do a frontal attack, which is very counter to what Sherman was planning for this entire campaign. So yeah, you understand by the roads, and also Marietta, you kind of have to take it anyway because it's along the Western and Atlantic Railroad on the way to Atlanta. So it doesn't really matter what sophisticated maneuver Sherman tried. He had to attack Kennesaw Mountain anyway. There was no other way around it. Like it commanded such a domineering position on the surrounding country that it had to be taken one way or another. And the final casualty count for the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was 800 odd for the Confederates, while for Johnston, while for Sherman, he suffered around 3,000, which those are the kind of casualties the Confederates needed in this campaign. They very much needed them. Like those, and this is one thing where kudos to Johnston. He chose his ground well, and he did not, and his men were disciplined enough to know not to chase after the enemy. For example, when they were beaten back. Although it's worth noting, there were times where the Union troops, they'd be going up this wooded hill, almost like a mountain, as well, for example, it's called Big Kennesaw Mountain, obvious reasons. And the Confederate soldiers were just looking at this, going, how brave the Union soldiers truly were to have gone through such a try and attack such a unassailable position. So yeah, you just have this position where very unenviable position if you're Sherman, because you have to go through Marietta anyway. It's just there's no other way around it. So yeah, now yeah, I believe this map also does another good means of detailing some of the uh, ground. For example, you have a railway here. You've got gravelly plateau, which of course rugged ground that Johnson planned to defend at Adairsville, but factored out Soviets control again meant he couldn't defend Van Mills Cassville, which I mentioned earlier. Van Mills, then he had to retreat across the Etowah River past Allatoona. And then you have, for example, as a yacht, the mountains, as mentioned here, that Kennesaw area, before you get to Marietta. But they had to keep retreating anyway, because that was just reality. So yeah, this is these are the this is a sort of Confederate position. I know Alabaster. He recommended to me that book about Samuel Watkins. Samuel Watkins, for example, was at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and he does describe fairly well the ground and the entrenchments and so on that the Confederates had at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. So if you're looking for good description about this particular battle from a Confederate point of view, Colonel H, which I'll put him in a comment below this stream after I'm done. I'll put that in my list of sources afterwards for anyone interested in that. And meanwhile, this is what the Union forces were seeing. You see this very steep hill. I believe this was Little Kennesaw. This wasn't Big Kennesaw. I don't think it was, from the top of my head. So, yeah, you understand why the Union troops suffered such lopsided casualties through the battle relative to the Confederates who were defending. And yeah, very much of a terrible situation. Now, I believe was it which map was it? Yeah, Peachtree Creek here. So after Chattahoochee, after Johnston is forced to pull back next time across the Chattahoochee, it's at that point Braxton, Bragg, and Jefferson Davis have had enough of Johnston just constantly retreating and may just make the decision to sack him, and they put John Bell Hood in charge. Now, there were political intrigues as well. For example, there was a Texan politician by the name of Wigfall or Wighall. It's one of those two names, a Texas politician by that name, who was sent by Davis to sort of look at the condition of the Army of Tennessee and to look at what Johnston was doing. And essentially, you have this position where he said, yeah, he was a supporter of Johnston, and he saw the position on the ground, and he very much agreed with Johnston's strategy along the whole thing, which was you defend on ground of your choosing and make the enemy bleed while also pulling back to avoid a decisive battle that can risk everything, while at the same time forcing your enemy to move inward. And he has to bleed himself into his country. He has to, because one thing that people neglect when they look at military history is that when you look at a map and you say, oh, well, this army has X amount of men at the start of a campaign, and then by the time they get to, like, let's say a battle, for example, you have famously Napoleon at the start of 1812 in Russia, where he's got 500,000 men, or sorry, 600,000, and then by the time he gets to the Battle of Borodino, he's only got 100,000. Well, the vast majority of that force has to be put down in garrisons along the way. So for this entire advance up to this point, Sherman has to delegate forces to garrison along the railway, especially because he has to deal with, in case Joseph Wheeler, for example, ever has to interdict his supplies, or someone, God forbid, Nathan Bedford Forrest, were to assail him from the rear. So that's another thing that is worth bearing in mind when you see Sherman's troop numbers go down as he advances through here, this is also another reason behind his MO in March to the Sea was that essentially you have you have Sherman not being able to afford having to put down garrisons. So this is why the March to the Sea becomes as brutal as it ends up having to be. So yeah, as I mentioned, yeah, Johnson retreats across the Chattahoochee, but as the last straw for the government, who sack him off, and they put John Bell Hood in place. Now, John Bell Hood himself, to his credit, he did like there were times where he actually undercut Johnston's authority to, especially in front of his Georgian politician by the name of Hill, who was a supporter of Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. And the thing was, yeah, Johnston was undercut like by Hood, basically agreeing with Jefferson Davis that the Confederate Army ought to be a lot more aggressive in this campaign. And Johnston, at this point, like he's been nurturing doubts in his head about Hood's reliability, because I mentioned before, Johnston does rely on Hood a lot for advice and pointers as to what to think about doing. But as this campaign progresses, the political intrigues escalate, and you have a position where Johnson started to doubt that Hood is actually he started to doubt Hood is actually loyal to him, and is actually doubting that he's actually believing that Hood wants to replace him. And certainly when you got Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg floating Hood as a replacement, plus you've got Hood almost just undercutting Johnston's authority in front of elected politicians from Richmond, it really becomes a matter of this is where Johnston he starts to depend a lot less, and it just creates a lot of issues within Confederate command that really should not have taken place. And this is really where Jefferson Davis is his own worst enemy. Oh, what the bloody hell. Oh, piffle. What? Oh, what the hell? Sorry. Oh, bloody hell. Of course, my Twitter's down. I'm gonna have to. Oh, piffle. Slight technical issue. I'll see what bloody is going on, because I usually rely upon Twitter for my maps, where I post them. But piffle, I'm gonna have to. Okay. Yeah, I was about to hit up on Battle of Atlanta, so I'll see if I can find map of the Battle of yeah. So looks like I found a map. I have to go off. I'm gonna have to poach off Wikipedia for the time being. So yeah, Peachtree Creek, which suffice to say, yeah, you have this position where if I can get my where is it? So yeah, the thing about Battle Peachtree Creek, as you can see, so you got Mount Zion Church, you got Howell's Mill, you got Collier's Mill, and you got this sort of Daniel Branch. Like one thing you see in Civil War battles is there's pretty much every battle is fought along either a waterway or good defensive high ground for obvious reasons, because you can do that. So yeah, basically what happens is the Confederates under Hood, they go on the attack. So you have Stuart, sorry, and Hardy, they go on the attack. So you have, for example, around here you have Hooker in the center, and you have, for example, in the center you have Claiborne. You'd be around somewhat here, I think. I can't. I'll see if bloody Twitter is gonna. Yeah. Nah, that bloody. Yeah. So I'll just have to. So yeah, I say you got Hooker in the center, you got Palmer on the right, and you got a Brigadier General by the Newton on the Union left. So Union left would be somewhere around here, like nearby Collier's, somewhere around here, yeah, Collier's Bridge, kind of thereabouts. So yeah, you have Hardy and Stewart, they attack, and it's very much a position, and it's very much a position of they are able to throw back the Union for a time. But yeah, it's a matter of you just have this battle where bloody hell, like this is I apologize, chat. Twitter being down and screwing up my maps has really thrown it. So bear with me for a minute. Yeah. Now, at first, the Union are on the back foot, which is why, for example, in the casualty count after the battle, it's something like 1,000. It's not like nigh upon that, something like 2,000 Union casualties, while the Confederates under John Bell Hood, they suffer around 2,500. So, yeah, I must think it was under George Henry Thomas, which this is the same George Thomas, by the way, who would later lead the Union Army at the Battle of Franklin, where John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee gets absolutely mauled, to say the least, by what happened there, where Claiborne, for example, gets killed. And then, yeah, Peachtree Creek, for example, where it was kind of one of the things where Thomas still wins, but he wins on a much narrower margin. So, yeah, you have that. Not long after, 2 days after this battle, you then have a battle at Atlanta, which again you can see Union entrenchments around here along the Georgia Railroad, which again this was just a battle which didn't have to be fought. It was just John Bell Hood fighting a battle. Like, he outnumbered the Union troops, but the Union troops were dug in. And this is what Joseph Johnston wanted to avoid, was just attacking a well dug in Confederate force. But John Bell Hood, being a mature idiot, he just carries on, he just attacks. And he loses something like 5,000 men. Meanwhile, the Union troops, they lose around 4,000. Now, one noticeable casualty was James B. McPherson. And Sherman, of course, he wept when, like, Sherman himself wept when you had, like, the news of his victory, the news of his death. And this is a thing, yeah, where so McPherson, he gets replaced with Hooker. No, Hooker was planning on replacing him. That doesn't happen because, so the thing about Hooker and Sherman, they have history going back to the Mexican War, and Sherman, he did not particularly like, on a not on a personal level or anything, but on a sort of military level, he did not like Joseph Hooker all that much. So it's fair to say that Hooker feels aggrieved because he gets taken out of command altogether, and James B. McPherson's replacement is what was it? Slocum. That was it. It was Slocum who commands, and Hooker, of course, he feels cheated, and he very much bears a grudge for the rest of his life against Sherman. But I mean, I would say with Hooker, there were times where I would say he was a solid guy, but he was. But as I detailed before, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, for example, which is the main battle he's known for, if there's a slight setback against him, he just freezes. He's not the kind of guy who. It's not like Sherman or Grant, who, when things are against them, they're able to focus on the problem at hand. Instead, with Hooker, if he suffers a major reverse at all, it's really just a matter of it goes against, like, what he originally planned, and he freezes on the spot. It's really not. Yeah, it's just really a position where Hooker, getting rid of Hooker, probably I would say I don't blame Sherman for. And yeah, so let's see if yeah, so this is a map. I have a Battle of Ezra Church, which happens not right after Atlanta on the 20th of July, where, as you can see here, you've got Battle Hill, you got Ezra Church here, which is of course the name of a battle. Meanwhile, you have Blair, whose forces are not at all engaged, and this is not under Hood. This is under a guy called Stephen Dill Lee. Now, this guy, I did mention him in the Nathan Bedford Forest streams where he's a distant cousin of Robert E. Lee, and he's a guy who commanded Forrest's men at the Battle of Harrisburg, where stupidly he orders a frontal attack on a well-entrenched Union position and gets defeated fairly decisively. So yeah, as you can imagine, the Battle of Ezra Church is a slam dunk Union victory, by all means. Yeah, and as you, I don't like having to rely upon Wikipedia because I mean, for example, casualty counts. They do track, but it's one of those things where it's similar to when you look at the Eastern Front in World War II, where you can't trust it. But yeah, this is a thing like I'm having to go off this because, put simply, I don't know what's happened to Twitter. It just acted up where I post them on maps, and yeah, crap. So yeah. So after this, yeah, you get not long after this, you then have the fall of Atlanta, which disaster to say the least for Confederates. It's the one scenario that Jefferson Davis worked the most to avoid, and yeah, it's very much a scenario where I would blame Jefferson Davis more than anyone else for this particular circumstance because he's the one who got rid of Joseph E. Johnston, despite the fact that he didn't know the facts on the ground. Now, granted, there's also I can see where Jefferson Davis' point of view comes from, where he might think, well, Hood disagrees with Johnston, therefore there must be truth to Jefferson Davis' own opinion that Johnston was just too timid. Now, as I said at the start of the stream, I'm fully on board with what Joseph E. Johnston was, and indeed Sherman says in his own personal memoirs that Johnston was a one opponent in the Western Theatre, aside from Nathan Burton Forrest, who gave him the most anxiety. Very, very much that one figure where he could just look at him and go, yeah, he's the one figure he did not want to have to deal with at all. So yeah, it's really just a matter of if you're Sherman, Jefferson Davis getting rid of Johnston was the best thing for you. And yeah, this is where, of all the blame to be apportioned for the Confederate defeat, I have to blame Jefferson Davis, Braxton Bragg, as well as, of course, Jumbo Hood, in part. Now, I don't think Jumbo Hood thought he was going to get rid of Sherman through what he did, but nevertheless, a certain portion of the blame goes to him for what happens there, because, you know, if you're undercutting your own superior officer to politicians who have the ear of your president, that is going to have consequences, and it's going to lead to you getting promoted, which is why Jumbo Hood, of course, he takes leadership of the Army of the Tennessee in the time before the Battle of Atlanta, even though, as mentioned, he did not want it. But it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, it was just a matter of, well, I don't sympathise too much with Jumbo Hood in context of his campaign. And that's the thing, Sherman himself, who was saying in his personal memoirs, like, when he heard that Jumbo Hood was put in command of the army, yeah, suffice to say, he very much was relieved, because he knew one of his subordinates, I forget which one it was, but one of his subordinates actually knew Hood from before the war, and he said, look, expect him to attack. I mean, this is exactly what he does. He sallies out to attack, precisely to Sherman's advantage. Heavy Confederate casualties ensue, and the campaign goes a lot more smoothly. Everything goes to the advantage of Sherman after that, and that's all I can say with the Atlanta campaign in terms of Sherman's point of view, as well as Confederate reasons for why the Confederates lost the campaign. Now, I do think, my personal opinion is, I think Sherman, I mean, I would say to people watching, don't get me wrong, I do think Sherman was going to win this campaign regardless. I think he was too shrewd a guy, but to be defeated in the way that Joseph E. Johnston envisioned. However, Sherman was paying a terrible price in certain battles, especially Kennesaw Mountain, for what happened, where you just have this position where he's attacking the frontal position, which he never wanted to do. And yeah, and this is the thing, like I mainly mentioned more from a Confederate point of view for the particular campaign because Sherman, in his personal memoirs, I will say, in my personal opinion, it's not like he's got. I say him too scathing when I say put it this way, but I don't think he's got a massive load of interest because his point of view about it all is kind of hampered by the fact he's coming from his perspective. He has some idea of a Confederate point of view, but this is why, as mentioned, I will put my sources below the stream to uh, relay what books got the information from. So this is why, talking about Atlanta campaign, I've mentioned it more from a Confederate point of view, more than Sherman's point of view, because by all rights, I would say Sherman, he played his cards right like 9 times out of 10. Same with Joseph E. Johnston. And it was really just a game of cat and mouse between the two. It was only when John Bell Hood gets in charge that the bad campaign really becomes a slam dunk victory on the part of Sherman. And yeah, and Sherman makes no bones about that in his own personal memoirs. And this is the thing where I don't really have any problem. So one thing that can irritate me in retrospect is when you get revisionists after war who will say, "Oh well, this general only won because of poor opposition." Well, I would argue you can only do with the best that you got in front of you. So, for example, Sherman was having a right devil's nightmare with Joseph E. Johnston. Then comes in John Bell Hood, and well, the campaign goes a lot more swimmingly. And that doesn't detract away from Sherman's own skill as a battle commander. Like he was very, and it's worth noting as well. Sherman was a little quartermaster back in the Mexican War, so he knew full well how important logistics were. So even though there were times in the campaign where logistics were becoming a burden, his troops were not starving, unlike the Confederates. Because this is the thing, Joseph E. Johnston did care for his men, but there's only so much he could do on the logistical side of things. Although I will say it was a lot better than what Braxton Bragg did for his men. I will say that, as mentioned, for example, Samuel Watkins' book, that I will link below. So yeah, looks like Twitter, looks like Twitter's back up a minute, so I ought to be able to share my maps now. Okay, so yeah, after the Atlanta has now been taken, and this is where you get the March to the Sea, which this results in some reputation for Sherman. But I would say certain anecdotes you read about Sherman's point of view and activities, you understand why he does get the reputation, but he did not covet it, which is why after the war he does strike a really good friendship with none other than Nathan Bedford Forrest himself, which sounds strange to people of a modern day when you factor both were antagonists against one another, but it makes sense when you factor both men. They got a reputation neither had desired. In the case of Sherman, he gets known as a war criminal. Although I will say, Sherman, as I mentioned before at the start of the stream, Sherman, at the start of the war, he did not want to destroy the Southern institutions. But by this point of the war, he's so hardened by it. But especially when he gets to South Carolina, he's a lot more jaded and he's a lot less forgiving of Confederate resistance, as well as just overall a Confederate war effort altogether, and the civilians who supported it up to that point. And I can sympathise with that point of view personally, although I'm an outsider, so for Americans watching, I would say make of my point of view what you will. I won't begrudge anyone if they disagree with me for obvious reasons. So yeah, one thing you see here is that Sherman had to detach his army into separate columns because one thing because he says to Grant, look, when I'm setting out on this, I'm setting out not just cut away from supplies, but also from communication. So if I do this, I've got no communication lines whatsoever with Washington. And Grant just says, do as you propose. So, as mentioned, November, he sets off and he goes down, for example, through areas like you have, for example, Blair, Osterhaus, you got Kilpatrick in charge of cavalry, you got Slocum in charge of the Army of Georgia, Howard in charge of the Army of the Tennessee. I don't know why it says Army of just Army of Tennessee, it should be Army of the Tennessee. Never mind. Then you got 15th Corps under Osterhaus, which is actually this is one thing, and also another thing that people or it's very human, but also it's one of the things where a lot of men on McGregor just knew this and they just accepted this about Sherman. He was blatantly favoritist towards 15th Corps because 15th Corps was the one he commanded in the Vicksburg campaign. Like he had the most experience with them, and he often gave them some of the most difficult jobs. Which is why, for example, you see, for example, see the advance. You got some of the states where there were certain battles that happened along this way. Milledgeville, by the way, is worth knowing. Milledgeville here was a state capital of Georgia, because people think it's Atlanta. No, it wasn't. At this time, it was Milledgeville, because Atlanta was only like a town of like 20,000 people, if I remember correctly. It wasn't a very big place, all in all. So yeah, you have, but it just happened to be important because of the railways. So yeah, you have Sherman. He detaches his army into separate columns to all converge around Savannah. And the secret behind the speed was that they had to live off the land. And this leads to controversy, but the thing was, by the time after the Vicksburg campaign, where Grant and Sherman both realized you can actually live off the land, you can actually do it. It's feasible, and they're going to do it because, yeah, the circumstances of the war at this point demanded it. And there's and also this is handy as well. You got topography here, so it says 200 feet. So as you get nearer to the coast, it's really flat land, and a lot of this is like really boggy territory as well, like very swampy, just god awful terrain to try and maneuver in. So the fact that he's able to get all the way from Atlanta to Savannah, I think it's like 400 miles, give or take. I'll check actually. Bear with me. Sorry, 250 miles. 400 kilometers. Sorry, I got mixed up. So it's 400 kilometers, but 250 miles. So yeah, 250 miles from Atlanta to Savannah in the space of a couple of months. Yeah, and you see here, for example, you see the dotted line here. This is where the cavalry come in. Here, Waynesboro. Joseph Wheeler does fight with Kilpatrick's cavalry, but the thing is, Kilpatrick's cavalry outnumber and pretty much outclass at this point the Confederate cavalry, because the Confederate cavalry, they're not what they were back in the early days of war. So, I mean, there's an element of people say Wheeler disappointed Georgia with his lackluster performance. I just think it's the same with what happened to Nathan Bedford Forrest at Selma. It was just a matter of there was too much against him that there was no possible path of victory. And if I'm going to be honest, I don't really hold. This is one thing I don't hold against Wheeler, for example. Another thing is, so at Savannah itself, you got a couple of forts here, because it's worth noting you got waterways here which have to be taken for supplies, because the Eastern Theater's fleet is commanded by a guy called David Dixon Porter, if I'm getting that name right. And this is where at Savannah he's able to supply. So yeah, so going through the countryside, there are anecdotes of civilians having their houses plundered. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this went against orders. Like, Sherman gave orders that the only places that ought to be burnt to a crisp would be those of a military nature. So railways, railway terminals, like any sort of infrastructure or any sort of facet of the economy that could actually support a war effort were to be burnt. The only exceptions not to be burnt were houses, so of course residences, for obvious reasons, as well as medical places such as asylums and hospitals. Now, there are cases where looting does happen, but Sherman says himself, and it says in his personal memoirs, this is incidental and not at all the rule, which I'm inclined to believe, because by this, but this gets a lot murkier as you get, especially get into South Carolina, because there are a lot of very ugly activities that happen, and especially in the city of Columbia, the state capital. Yeah, I know at Milledgeville, for example, there's an anecdote where a bunch of the soldiers, what they did was they organized themselves as almost like sort of like a sort of small congress, like a small puppet congress, like a that felt more like a Punch and Judy performance rather than an actual congress, but like just a bunch of soldiers getting drunk, or like just satirical, where they voted within the Georgian House of Representatives and said, "Oh, we repeal secession." It's kind of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. So there's not, it's not like a massive thing. It's just a more of a sort of morale boosting kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention, as a tail note of the Atlanta campaign, the Atlanta campaign was originally meant to end with Sherman pinning down and destroying Johnston's army. He wasn't able to do that. However, however, Atlanta doesn't lend itself to an even greater strategic benefit, and that is Lincoln's re-election in November. With Lincoln's re-election, that was really like the last chance for the South gone, because the Southerners were believing that if George B. McClellan, who was a Democrat candidate, had gotten in, then the Civil War would end a lot better on their terms, but it wasn't to be. Although in time, the South would realise Lincoln was their best hope. So yeah, you get the numerous columns marching down. Now, there's not really any massive battles along here. It's just a lot of burning down of railways, tearing of railroads, and things of that nature. And you see here like the topography and nature goes really against any sort of advance. So there's an element of you can't fault Sherman for doing a really speedy advance in spite of many difficulties along the way. Now, one thing, there's a place here called Ebenezer Creek, which, if I go, now, from my, so this guy Jefferson C. Davis was a Union general who at Ebenezer Creek, what he did was so one of Sherman's orders at the start of the campaign was look, because he understood that there were plenty of these former slaves who were wanting to join the main Union army and try and get their own opportunities for freedom. The thing was, he said to his army commanders from the outset, look, if you're in a dilemma where you have to choose between supplying the army and supplying the civilians, the army takes place every time, because we put it simply, we cannot have the army starving on our advance because we need to bring the war to an end as soon as possible. Jefferson C. Davis, he gets into a bit of controversy where at Ebenezer Creek, he burns down the pontoon bridge after all these 15,000 men are across, but the 600 former slaves, mainly a lot of women and children, as well as old folks, they are cut off by him burning this pontoon bridge at Ebenezer Creek, and these 600 former slaves are rounded upon and slaughtered by Joseph Wheeler's cavalry. Now, this is seen as a black mark against Jefferson C. Davis. I will say Sherman had borne no ill will. I mean, in fact, like he agreed with what Jefferson C. Davis had done. And I'm looking at it from an outsider perspective. My own personal opinion is I do agree with what Jefferson C. Davis had done. Like I think it's all well and good having a moral compass, but orders. The order of the day was look, the advance of the army took precedence over all other things. The fact that the former slaves were following these armies and slowing them down compromised the military objectives, and in so doing, it was to a military advantage that you kind of have to do stuff like that. Now, there was one officer serving under Davis by the name of James Connolly, who referred to him in no uncertain terms as an infernal copperhead, which for non-American audiences, copperhead means northern, like basically mainly refers to northern Democrats who opposed the war and wanted peace with the South as soon as possible. Now, Jefferson C. Davis was a war Democrat. and he was a political general in that sense. So calling him a copperhead was one of the most scathing insults you could deliver to someone of that time, to say the least. Yeah. So yeah, this is why as mentioned, I don't fault Jefferson C. Davis for doing what he did. I think he had to make a tough decision, and he did the best in the circumstances he could. So yeah, I mean, people are free to disagree. That's my personal opinion about it all. But I'm also thinking, but as I said, like William T. Sherman himself in his own memoirs, also he stated, look, he bore no ill will against what Davis did. So yeah, that's my personal prerogative around it. So yeah, as you can see, I did share this map earlier, but it shows all the railways, as mentioned. So you have Atlanta, you have, for example, railways going down to Charleston, which is the capital of South Carolina, and you have railways going down to Savannah. And the thing about Savannah, of course, it was picked because there was a railway junction kind of area going from Charleston, and you can trace a railway through areas like Grahamville, Beaufort, Pocatello, all the way to Charleston, and then you can march further up north. Because after the march to the sea is concluded in December, as you get into January, in January he mainly rests and recuperates his forces because they've had some issues along the way, logistics and so on. They need to also formulate of grant what plan they are to make regarding their advance into the Carolinas, because it's worth noting at this point in the war, Grant is holed up around here in Petersburg, just south of Richmond. So Grant is saying to Sherman, look, as soon as you can come up for the Carolinas, the better, because if you can get into the rear of Lee, as well as prevent a junction of the remnants of the Army of Tennessee meeting up with the Army of Northern Virginia, great. Sherman did say at this point, like he said, look, push comes to shove, he is willing to face off against the junction of armies of Lee and Johnston if they should meet up, and he can fight against them for a day, provided that he knows Grant will reinforce him on a second day of a hypothetical battle. It doesn't come to that, fortunately, for Sherman and Grant, because there's different interpretations of why Lee holed himself up in Petersburg. Because because Lee actually said to Jefferson Davis, I believe a year before this, he said, "Look, the worst scenario is that the Union Army pins us down, and they besiege me in such a position that I'm not able to flee." And Lee ends up doing this with the Battle of Petersburg, where he gets holed up and bottled up, and there's different interpretations. Like, for example, there's one interpretation that he actually wanted to just end the war as soon as possible. And so he was willing for himself to get bottled up in Petersburg so as to convince Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, to throw him a towel. Now, if that is indeed the interpretation of Lee's behavior, I'm thinking that's a very masochistic one, if ever I could hear one. Like, I've never heard of a general who was willing to put his own army into such a disadvantageous position to screw over the chances of his own side in the Civil War, for example, or just any war altogether. So I'm not likely to believe that personally. I've never known a general to go out of his way to screw over his own side. I just think it's a matter of Lee was just too emotionally attached to Virginia. And Joseph E. Johnston, meanwhile, he was going through he was at this point he was in the Carolinas area, somewhere like, I believe around here, like Charlotte, I believe it was, towards the latter end of the war, as well as up to Danville area, when he does hear of the surrender of Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, where a couple of weeks later Joseph Johnston surrenders. There we are. To pick up. So yeah, you have Sherman. He in February and March he goes up for the Carolinas. At this place called Cheror, there's actually an arsenal of Confederate munitions, something like 3,500 barrels worth of gunpowder, which some dumb Union soldier for dumb reasons, basically, he decided to load a cigar right next to the gunpowder. So there's a massive explosion of all this gunpowder at the arsenal in Chevrolet, and it's one of the things where you can, yeah. And William T. Sherman himself, he was just dumbstruck that someone could be so stupid as to smoke a cigar, no less, next to 3,500 barrels of gunpowder. Like, there's no other word to say other than profoundly stupid. And yeah, that all that gunpowder was just blown up. But yeah, after this, yeah, Chevrolet was a big loss for the Confederates in the same way that the loss of Selma in early April was also a big loss. But to be fair, Selma being lost anyway, when Nathan Bedford Forrest was there, was redundant loss anyway, because of the fact that Sherman already cut the Confederates in another slice by taking Savannah and then marching up the coast. So you have here also Columbia, where I did mention some ugly things going on there. Where so one thing that happened was it wasn't far from a POW camp where a bunch of Union prisoners were recently freed, alongside recently freed slaves, and they went on a rampage in the town. Not helped by, of course, by the fact that the governor of the state of South Carolina, he did not think it was a good idea to get rid of all the whiskey in the town. So all the alcohol that the city had is still around, ready to be consumed by the soldiers who go marauding through the city. So this is why when civilians in the city of Columbia, South Carolina, they say to Sherman, "You ought to get your men under control," he just says to them, "Look, it's your problem here because you gave these people alcohol. You basically might as well have given it to them because you didn't destroy it." And I'm minded to say he had a point there, because Sherman can try as he may, but trying to discipline a bunch of drunk soldiers bent on marauding, as well as a lot of soldiers, by the way, who had personal vendettas against South Carolina because they felt that South Carolina started the war, because of course that's where Fort Sumter was, and that's where maybe were the first state to secede. Yeah, a lot of bitterness and a lot of ugly, intimate behavior happened in Colombia. I don't know precisely of stuff like rape, but certainly there were cases where, for example, you have these Southern families who, let's say, their children had a blanket. Well, these Union soldiers would just go and take the blankets off these Confederate families of these children. It's just behavior which you can't really defend, if I'm going to be honest. So there is some realms of understanding where I can understand why people have a black mark against Sherman. I'm also agreeing with Sherman in that the Confederates having left such a heavy stockpile of alcohol in the city ready to be consumed was the worst of all worlds, and the Confederates have only themselves to blame for what happened here. And yeah, and this is one thing where Sherman makes a point of this a lot, where he would say it's not him to blame for a lot of these towns burning to the ground. It's more of Confederate mistakes. So, for example, Atlanta families gets burnt down. Now, John Bell Hood was the guy who started the fire, but Sherman did not do any effort to put it out, really, because it suited Sherman fine to burn down Atlanta anyway, because he wanted the civilians out. The main reason being that he did not want to have a beefed up garrison, because one thing, for example, with a place like Memphis, Tennessee, was that it had to have a sizable garrison because it's such a big place full of people. In the same way that if Atlanta still had all 20,000 people living there, you'd have to have a pretty big garrison to defend the place. Whereas if it's depopulated, Sherman has a lot more strategic flexibility. He doesn't have to garrison so many places when he's depopulating these towns through forced expulsions and so on, which on a strategic level, it makes sense. Now, the thing about it is, like, there's not really, like, because some people on a historical level, they might try and historically equivocate with Suffolk Confederates did. You know, it's one of those situations where I can sympathize, with Sherman's total war, but at the same time, the Confederates never really did it, so that's why some Confederate supporters would argue, well, we never did it, and mainly because they never had the opportunity to do so. So, yeah, there were a few opportunities they did, and mainly in Kentucky. But small fry compared to the March of the Sea. March of the Sea. Yeah, but that's my perspective as well. It's total war. I mean, it's like I was reading a book earlier called "Destructive War" by Charles Royster, where sort of the destruction of a war, and it's not just William T. Sherman who argued for this kind of total warfare. It was also Stonewall Jackson, and yeah, Stonewall Jackson also he was completely correct. It was just that Jefferson Davis never listened to him to his detriment because of course Stonewall Jackson had the same idea where he argued for getting 10,000 men at least, or an entire army corps, no less, and going up into places like Maryland and Pennsylvania and just burning it all to a crisp, especially with railways and anything that might support the war effort, which, yeah, as Sherman himself would answer, like, but this total war he waged on the South, it worked. Yeah. And, yeah, so you have, for example, there's very blurry map. I got it from a Atlas book, which apparently these maps here you can see apparently they use them in West Point, apparently, which quite cool to know. I will link the name of a book that I got this from as well after the stream is done. So, for example, Grant and Lee up here. You've got Raleigh. I think like Raleigh was the last major population center to fall to Sherman because it's April 2nd, Petersburg falls, and then the next day, April 3rd, Richmond falls, and then a week later, on April 9th, Lee famously surrenders at Appomattox. So 2 weeks after that, Joseph E. Johnston surrenders his army, what remnants he had after John Bell Hood's disaster at Franklin and Nashville. So, and then not long after that, you have Nathan Burtwood Forrest on April 27th, and then you have, I think it was in May, but you had the last Confederate surrender by a Cherokee chief who's something Smith, I believe his name was. Stan Watty, that was it. Stan Waiter, yeah. Or Stan Hubble, Isaac S. Whitey, yeah. Cherokee guy who was the last Confederate general to surrender, which is not very well known amongst a lot of people. Amongst a lot of people who study the American Civil War. At least I only know it because certain videos because I'm very much interested in sort of that Native American history, which I plan on doing Native American history one day on this channel. Don't know when, but I know I'll do, especially the commentary and Texas Rangers, who deserve a stream, in my humble opinion. So yeah, now this is one thing where this was on the board of River Queen. I think this was in, I forget the date now, but this is from a painting called The Peacemakers. So you have Lincoln here, who very much is pondering. He's in the center. There's got a rainbow in the background, which, yeah, you can tell that it's very much matter of like sort of light at the end of the tunnel. That's what I was trying to prove. Ulysses S. Grant, who because the thing about Grant and Sherman was very, very, very much best of friends with one another. So, because the thing with Sherman himself in his memoirs, as well as outside in life, he would say that he was smarter than Grant, but Grant was a better guy than him. And there's that famous quote where Sherman says, Grant stuck by me when I was insane, and I stuck by him when he was drunk. Now, that quote is a bit of an oversimplification because I don't think Grant was ever drunk throughout the Civil War. I think his main vice in the Civil War was actually smoking loads of cigars that people donated him that caused him throat cancer. That is very coincidental. Yeah, that was a book I read last year about the commentary, where it talks a fair bit about the Texas Rangers, about like how much the commentary actually respected them and so on. So yeah, at some point I will do a stream about the Texas Rangers because I don't think there's much content on YouTube about them, which is a shame because the Texas Rangers are, I would say, they're the Cossacks of America. I would say because the commentary were very much like were very much like the Tatars of the Great Plains in terms of how much of a menace they were to America, and especially for settlers. While the Texas Rangers, they were kind of like the because the Cossacks, similar to the Texas Rangers, they learned off their enemy, and that's why they became such superb horsemen. So yeah, very interesting part of history. I aim to do a stream about it at some point. I don't know when. It'll probably be much later in the year, if not next year. Uh, yeah, very much yeah. So yeah, I have this is David Dixon Porter. He's a rear admiral in charge of the fleet along the Eastern Theater coastline, and you'll of course have William T. Sherman here, who is very much telling because yeah, this was in I think this is mid to late January or early February, which is where they're coming up with a battle plan to decisively end the war because Lincoln did not want to have another big battle because he wanted the war ended as soon as possible, as bloodlessly as possible. But Sherman and Grant were telling him it might come to a massive battle with someone like Lee, or perhaps Lee and Johnston forming up. But as we know, it doesn't happen that way. And yeah, and I mean, this thing was another anecdote that happened was so because I mean Lincoln gets assassinated on April 15th. I believe it's April the 25th, if memory serves me right, where Johnston and Sherman, they met up at a place called Bennett's Farm. This little farm in North Carolina that they meet up with. The farming couple there, they actually had to give the room to Sherman and Johnston. When Sherman told Johnston the news of Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth, Sherman knew instantaneously that Johnston was horrified by it. Like by that point in the war, I think Sherman said himself, like the Southerners at this point, they knew Lincoln was actually a better friend to them than they originally believed, and his death was actually a massive boon to the radical Republicans because, as stated, like as much as, for example, people can say about someone like William T. Sherman, the devastation he wrought. The radical Republicans were insane at the start of the war. They were arguing for treating women and children in the same way as combatants, which I just look at that and go, I'm in favour of that. Like Thaddeus Stevens, some of the statements I read about Thaddeus Stevens saying in the early stages of the war, I certainly do think I used to think it was overkill when the Southerners would argue that guys like Thaddeus Stevens and other radical Republicans had a bloodlust against the South, but the more I read about them, the more I start to believe that's actually the case, to be fair, which is why Robert E. Lee favours reconciliation, for example, so much, as well as Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.C. Beauregard and others, because basically they were arguing, okay, let's get reconciled with the North as soon as possible so that we can block off radical Republicans from doing their damage on the South. Because, Lincoln's assassination emboldens them, and this is one reason why the South was so horrified about what John Wilkes Booth had done. But yeah, anyway, so Sherman. Another thing that Sherman had to deal with after the war is Edwin Stanton, who is the Secretary of War, has this massive tiff with him, for lack of a better way of expressing it, like just massive argument, where I just look at, I can easily just look at it and go, I don't even have to read anything about Edwin Stanton to know that Edwin Stanton he had a massive disdain for West Pointers, and he did not particularly like William T. Sherman all that much. And in this case, it was a matter of you have William T. Sherman. He gives really generous terms to Joseph E. Johnston in the same way that Grant gave really generous terms over to Lee, which was fully in the spirit of what Lincoln wanted. But Edwin Stanton, after Lincoln's assassination, all of a sudden he turns on Sherman quick as a flick, which, yeah, I safe to say, I mean, I don't think, Sherman didn't do anything wrong on that one. I mean, Sherman was fully in bed with what Lincoln wanted in terms of reconciliation. And, Sherman himself, he even goes on a sort of brief tirade in his personal memoirs at that point, like towards in the end of the war chapter, where he just says, I've never disobeyed an order in my life. Even if I found an order distasteful or stupid, he always obeyed it to the best of his ability. And that's why after the war, Sherman and Stanton really do not get on well. in the same way that Grant and Andrew Johnson do not get on very well. So yeah, I just think um, with Sherman, it's a matter of I can't think. Yeah, there are certain anecdotes in the context of, for example, the destruction of Columbia, like the state capital of South Carolina, where you can look at it and go, yeah, where you can look at it and you go, yeah, Sherman, he should have controlled his men a lot better. However, I would also say I would say even someone as stern as the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsula campaign, the Peninsula War, sorry, he had to struggle with discipline with his men. With, for example, the infamous the siege of Baderhof, where hundreds of civilians got killed, and similar goes on with South Carolina, where the soldiers, yeah, they do some, I would argue, very disgusting things towards the civilians of South Carolina, like things that didn't have to happen. I know that civil wars are very intimate and ugly, but yeah, I think there are some things where I think there's a fair point to say Sherman, he should have controlled his men better in context of a march to the sea, and in his Carolinas campaign. However, I will say broadly, yeah, I think at the end of the day, Sherman did everything to the best of his ability. He was waging total war, and it's like that monologue I quoted last week about Sherman, where because he was warning the South, look, you might be really determined and brave. I mean, there's no doubt because I can say this without fear of contradiction. I genuinely think the Southerners were probably the bravest men of that time in human history. Because I mean, you look at the disadvantages the South had in terms of material and logistics and the economy and other things of that, and yet the Southerners were able to hold their own for such a long time. Like I would say, yeah, it's no wonder why so many Southerners are so proud of of our ancestors who fought in the war. Because I would be in their position, which is one thing. This is one reason I'm doing these streams, by the way, is because there are plenty of people online who like Aton Shea and other people who very much have a very much a pro-union point of view that I just think leaves out nuance for the South. And certainly there's a lot of revisionism, like I saw on Twitter. For example, some guy posting about Robert E. Lee saying overrated and all this. It's like, there's no shame for Northern to say that the South was a really brave and determined opponent. Like there's no doubt in Southern valor. And even to this day, for example, Southern boys make up the vast majority of military recruits. Perhaps not vast majority, but point still stands. Yeah. So where to leave off? So yeah, there's not much to say about Sherman after the war. Like he does become commanding general of the U.S. Army when Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and he attends a lot of and he does have his own actually, it's not technically his own, but he does chair over a fair few associations of soldiers after the war, a lot of veterans associations and other such kind of leagues. It's worth noting that Sherman was fairly conservative in his leanings. He did not have any sense of ill will towards the South. So while he did, so while like on one hand, like Ulysses S. Grant, for example, while Ulysses S. Grant, he was far more of a Reconstructionist in the sense of black suffrage. Sherman was a lot more nuanced. Like he wasn't really. I mean, some of his opinions would get him cancelled today, to say the least. Yeah. I know one step that really punches above its weight is Texas, and I know when I'm going to do Ulysses S. Grant because I'm going to come across the Overland campaign. One of my favorite anecdotes is when Lee was leading the Texans, and the Texans were actually holding his saddle, saying, "Sir, you should not go any further. That we don't want you to get killed," because very much Lee looks upon a lot of his Texans in the same way that Napoleon looked upon his Imperial Guard. You have that famous scene from Waterloo where Napoleon is riding ahead of his Imperial Guard as they're advancing upon Wellington. Lee was doing the same with his Texan brigade at the Battle of the Wilderness, and Lee was actually saying words to the effect of, "Oh, they will never see the back of my Texans," because it's like the Battle of Antietam, for example, the Texas Brigade there, they suffered 80% casualties under John Bell Hood. So, yeah, the Texans punch above their weight, certainly, uh, from what I've studied thus far. I would say, yeah, the set altogether really punches above their weight in terms of like military bravery and valor. And I believe and there was a quote by a Texan serving in my brigade where he said words to the effect of, "I will charge into hell itself for that old man." Old man, of course, being Robert E. Lee. And yeah, so and yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, because it's yeah, I can't fault the Seth at all for the Confederate flags. I know that's one. That's one thing. Like the last I heard was the Confederate flag has been banned from number plates in Virginia, which I just find really petty, to say the least. If not just everybody, I just think it's part of their heritage. Let them celebrate. You know, yeah. So I think there's not much to be said for Sherman after the war. I would say he dies in 1891. I thought he died in 1881 for some reason, but I misread it. It was 1891. Funnily enough, there's an anecdote of him a year before his death where he was at a public event. I believe it was like an anniversary of the Civil War or a US Army event, something like that, where they were playing the song Marching for Georgia. And it's worth noting that that's why I don't play it for this song. The reason I don't play it for these streams is that Sherman hated that song. Like he very much despised this sort of triumphalism that a lot of Northerners had. Like the rap, that's one thing. Yeah, yeah. To be fair, it's not a matter of distraction. I'm doing it myself, so I'm to blame for this sense of detraction a bit because but it's kind of relevant to the whole point of like just me talking about Civil War and so on, so I don't see it as a distraction because I'm still able to focus on the topic at hand anyway, so I don't mind. But yeah, I would say with with Sherman, he hated that song "Marching for Georgia," which is why but the thing is, ironically, it's always associated with him, and they even played it at his funeral, which was like a massive state funeral, no less, because I think Sherman, if I remember correctly, I think the only reason he wasn't a pallbearer at Ulysses S. Grant's funeral was because I don't think he was physically able to at that point. I don't think. I think he wasn't a pallbearer. I know Winfield Scott Hancock, he was a pallbearer, and and it was very much a grandiose affair for obvious reasons. Sherman was also, and there's a reason why when William T. Sherman releases his memoirs in 1875, 10 years after the war, it's one of the most sought after Civil War books. I mean, certainly I've got. I'm saying that's one of the main books I'll study for anything about the Civil War for obvious reasons. And to finish it off, because I'll finish off at the 2 hour mark, I'll just say Sherman is a very nuanced character. Like certainly it's very irritating when I see Reddit type people who will claim Sherman as a talisman, which is ironic because if you read his memoirs, you'll know that people will know that for example, he has no problem saying the N word because he was a man of his time, and also his opinions over blacks, like he was no way a racial egalitarian. Like he would not be a libtard in today's world. In fact, it's fair to say that he would be much further to the right than Trump, for example, in America. So it's quite funny to me when I'm like, and I'm an outsider, by the way. Like, so I'm not even American myself, but I can see a mile off that William T. Sherman just wasn't this libtard icon that Reddit claims him to be, and why the March to the Sea is a lot more nuanced than when I see some Southerners say it was a war crime, and other people who will say it was 100% good. It was just one thing where it's just the Civil War was a massive tragedy from the start. Same with the English Civil War, like the devastation that Cromwell did on Ireland. I mean, I can argue it as a matter of sort of necessity, but nowhere would I be a triumphalist. about it. In the same way, yeah, it's one thing as well that triumphalism about the March to the Sea as well. I mean, Sherman himself didn't like it. Some people did it in his lifetime, but a lot of the triumphalism I see around that particular chapter of the Civil War, very recent thing, and you know, it's very much connected to all the BLM stuff, especially in 2020, and sort of recent trend of toppling down Confederate statues, which I know, for example, you know, in a way, I suppose a small mercy that, for example, Shelby Foote is not alive today because, you know, God knows what he would make of, for Stonewall Jackson's statue, for example, getting vandalized, for example. Yeah, I know. I know that's another thing I will do. In June, I will get round to reading Shelby Foote's trilogy because I've got it on my bookshelf, and I will. That's one series of books I really do want to get around to reading because there's I've only read his Shiloh book thus far, and well, if his writing style in that trilogy is anything like in Shiloh, I like it very much. I will like it very much because he's very good at describing locations. Because this is one thing about Shelby Foote in his books is that he often went to the battlefield around the anniversary of said battles. So, for example, when he describes the Battle of Shiloh, basically, you know, I'm looking at Shiloh, for example, because this is where Sherman, for example, gets a lot of criticism unduly. And I mean, the thing about Shiloh was it's a very ugly battlefield because it's like fighting a Napoleonic style battle in, but it's like fighting a Napoleonic style battle in Mirkwood from Hobbit, like very much leafed over. You can go from one end of a battlefield without marching a foot in actual sunlight. That's angered me. Yeah, I'm the same now. After I did not know that, but yeah, I'm not surprised because you see Reddit all the time claiming he's a lost causer and oh well he's a racist because he once said because he said on that Ken Burns documentary he would have fought for the Confederacy as a Mississippian, which shock horror Southerners aren't going to be self-loathing. It's just yeah, I just look at this and yeah, I mean yeah, it's just, yeah, I yeah. There's not really much more to say other than just to say it. That also gets me livid as well. But yeah. So another oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention in terms of Atlanta campaign. Another thing that so Sherman he's very much seen as the harbinger of total war in the way that we think of it today. So for example, you know, you have him burning down anything that's militarily useful. But also the Atlanta campaign would not have been possible without the trains. I mean, this is one thing. I don't know if I could do a stream about it, but there's often this idea that we Europeans could have learned from the American Civil War in time for the First World War, which I will say I don't agree with that because it's like around the same time of the American Civil War, you had for example, you have the German Wars of Unification, which as well as the Italian Wars of Unification, which were very atypical compared to the American Civil War because with America, it's a massive country. You know, the distance, for example, between like Memphis and Washington is like the same distance between like Paris and but it's like the same distance. I think same distance as between like Paris and Königsberg in East Prussia. Like that's how distant the theaters were, and you couldn't really afford to have massive armies like what we could have in Europe. Where, for example, you know, in 1859, for example, during the Second Italian War of Independence, it was something like you had something like something like 300,000 guys in Lombardy concentrated on both sides into an area that was the same size as New Hampshire, which is that's one thing that American Civil War historians probably can't wrap their heads around. It's just how utterly concentrated European armies used to be, which is why we never thought the American Civil War could actually be this harbinger of doom in the same way that World War One proved to be. And also, it's not just that. I mean, do you feel like certain things will learn from the American Civil War, like the importance of railroads and logistics. Because the German army in 1871, well, it's just say the Prussian army, I mean, very much used the trains in such a way that outshone even like what Sherman did in the Atlanta campaign, and or what Stonewall Jackson did in the Valley campaign. And this is why, I would say it's very much a matter of, yeah, I would say like the American Civil War. I mean, very interesting to me. Like the more I read about it, the more interested, and uh, I imagine guys like Alabaster and others who are American. I mean, it's like the same with when I see Americans like that vlogging through history guy who are interested in the English Civil War. It's kind of like, it's kind of funny, but also it's like, you feel honored by it in the same way that I imagine Americans are honored when Englishmen such as myself are interested in the Civil War, in the American Civil War. But anyway, yeah. So, but I'll just conclude with saying, yeah, I think with Sherman as these two streams have made it have concluded, I think, yeah, look, Sherman is a man of his time. I see him as a very nuanced figure. I don't think he's a good guy in the like sort of black and white sense, but he's no villain. Like, I just think he did the best he could in the circumstances he did, and he's like John Bell Hood and Joseph E. Johnston after the Civil War. They said about Sherman, look, he didn't do anything wrong with what he did. He did what we would do in his circumstances, and yeah, that's just the brutality of war. So, yeah, that's my perspective in there. So if anyone disagrees with that, I mean, yeah, people can feel free to disagree with me in the comments below, because I'm fairly, yeah, I'm fairly acceptable with you, as long as the only thing I won't accept about the American Civil War is always Reddit tier crap I see about like insulting Confederate war dead, or I see people glorifying the devastation. Always like, that disgusts me, and I'm not even American. I just, yeah, yeah, yeah. Cheers for Alabaster, and yeah, I can imagine, yeah, a lot of Americans such as yourself also interested in British history, which again, that kind of warms me in a sense, yeah. So, I think I'm done. I think that's the matter concluded. Yeah. To wrap up the stream, I will say I will be back next week on the 24th, because the 23rd is St. George's Day. I'm not going to do a stream on that day because I don't feel. I'll do it on the 24th instead. Ulysses S. Grant Part 1, and yeah. Yeah, that's all right. I don't. Yeah, I don't know if I don't. I don't know if it's something that you have to have a certain threshold of subscribers to be able to accept that stuff like super chats or something. I don't know, but I wouldn't say I'll probably will set up an entropy at some point. I'm basically just too lazy, so I will set it up at some point. I probably will set it up before next week, because next week on the 24th I'll be doing Ulysses S. Grant. I'm not. At the moment, I'm not fully. I might just call it the American Ulysses Soldier President Legends, but I'm not fully sure yet what the title will be. I might run a poll on it. If I do so, I will put in the post and I'll link it on places. So yeah, yeah. I will say that, yeah, for anyone interested in sending me, let's say, super chat for argument's sake or whatever, yeah, I'll set up entropy most likely for next week. I'll link it, pin it next week. So yeah, as I said, next week I'm doing Ulysses S. Grant. I have 4 books about him, so yeah, I've got a lot to read, and yeah, I can see why you. Yeah, I'll just. I forgot to mention my at the end. I'll mention it now. Yeah, I will say it's very much this Southern Storm of Steel, like very much detailing the conditions. Because one thing, for example, reading Ernst Junger, Storm of Steel, it gets you to understand the German point of view about the war in the same way that Samuel Watkins. I mean, I would say that, yeah, I'd say it's a good read for anyone interested in the Civil War from a sort of rank and file point of view. Because another book, Oh, see if it's, I'll screen share it actually. It's on my. I believe I've got it somewhere. Uh, while I'm here because it's a good book. I don't know if people have heard of it. So yeah, there's a book by the name of How a One-Legged Rebel Lives by a guy called John S. Robson. Basically, he's a guy who served under Stonewall Jackson. So he's another rank and file guy, and I will say I've only read like the first 50 odd pages, but like the thing about it is when you read it, you really come to realize how much Virginia very much reminds you of a Shire from Lord of the Rings. How he describes it, especially the Shenandoah Valley, which I mean, yeah, very much, yeah. It's that kind of book that helps me to sort of. That's one of the main reasons I actually sympathise with the Sev, especially Virginia in the American Civil War, because the way this guy describes it, it's just a rank and file soldier. Like this is one thing. Another thing about it for me is very eloquent language. Certainly the kind of language that unfortunately doesn't get used that much nowadays. Like I'll look at, for example, my peers of my generation. They can't write like this guy does. And this guy was a private. It wasn't like a full-fledged officer or general. It wasn't a wealthy guy by any means. But yeah, he writes in such a way that it's beautiful to read because it's describing Virginia like the Shire. So yeah. So I'll conclude with that. Yeah. Famous song question. I'll look that up after. Also, I said I was going to link the books after tomorrow morning because I'm kind of headache, but the headache is gone now, so I might well just do it. I might well just do the stuff I need to right after. So without further ado, I'll end the stream here now because just to reiterate, yeah, I'll be back next week on the 24th doing Ulysses S. Grant Part 1, which that stream might well run to 2.5 hours because I'm probably going to have to do 5 hours altogether. I mean, not 5. Yeah, I'm probably going to have to do 5 hours altogether on Ulysses Grant because there's so much material to cover about that guy, so much grand and battles and so on. But yeah, farewell. See you all next week. And adieu.